He used to sleep on Egyptian cotton sheets, the kind so smooth they almost whispered against the skin. Now, the silence around him is broken only by the hum of an old refrigerator in a half-empty apartment, and the mattress beneath him is thin, uneven, stripped of any luxury. Kenneth Lay stares at the ceiling, the paint chipped and yellowing, and wonders how a man who once dined with presidents and billionaires ended up here alone, disgraced and haunted by the echoes of his own empire. There is something cruel about memory. It doesn't arrive politely. It strikes. And for Kenneth, it often begins with the flash of cameras, the applause of shareholders, the intoxicating taste of adoration. He had been a man who built not just a company, but an illusion so grand that even the brightest minds of Wall Street believed in it. He was celebrated, admired, envied. Enron was not just a corporation. It was a myth. And Kenneth Lay had been its prophet. But to understand the fall, one must begin with the climb. Kenneth was not born into marble halls or silver spoons. His beginnings were humble, the son of a poor Baptist minister in Missouri. He remembered his father's calloused hands, the modest church services, the quiet dinners where faith was the only wealth they had. Poverty, though, did not crush him. It planted something else instead: hunger. Hunger to rise above. Hunger to prove that a boy from nothing could command the world. In college, he studied economics like a man starved. He wasn't just learning theory, he was studying power. How money moved, how nations shifted under the invisible hand of markets. To his classmates, he seemed reserved, polite, almost modest. But inside, a storm of ambition brewed. He wasn't chasing wealth for wealth's sake. He was chasing significance, the feeling that he would never again be small, overlooked, or powerless. That storm carried him upward. Government work, then corporate corridors, each step a stage where he learned how power was traded in whispers and contracts. By the time he stood at the helm of Enron, Kenneth Lay was no longer that poor boy from Missouri. He was a man with the ear of presidents, a name that opened doors across the world. In the skyscrapers of Houston, Enron's logo gleamed against the sky, and Lay himself became the embodiment of the American dream. To the public, he was the visionary. To employees, he was the benevolent leader who encouraged innovation, who spoke of values, who wrapped deception in the language of morality. He played the part so well that even he began to believe it. The company thrived on risk, on pushing boundaries, on creating profits from air if needed. And Kenneth stood at the center of it all, smiling, reassuring, promising that the future would always bend in his favor. But beneath the gloss, something darker pulsed. Numbers that didn't quite add up, deals that shimmered with unreality, promises too good to be true. At first, these were whispers he brushed aside. Every empire, he told himself, had cracks, but cracks could be hidden, smoothed over, delayed. Success was a performance, and as long as the show went on, who cared about the scaffolding behind the stage? The applause was addicting. He had tasted poverty, and now he drowned in luxury private jets, sprawling mansions, handshakes with the most powerful men alive. He liked to imagine himself as untouchable, a titan born from faith and grit, but power has a way of making men deaf. He stopped hearing the warnings, the murmurs of dissent. Even as the foundations of Enron trembled, Kenneth Lay smiled for the cameras, his words polished, his faith unshaken. It was hubris, perhaps, that blinded him. Or maybe it was desperation. The truth is that once you build a kingdom on illusions, you must keep the illusions alive. Because if one curtain falls, the audience will see the trick. And so Kenneth pressed forward, feeding the machine, demanding more brilliance, more miracles, more paper profits to cover the rotting core. Then came the collapse. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Stock prices wobbling, analysts asking sharper questions, journalists digging deeper. Lay tried to brush it off, to stand tall, to remind everyone of Enron's reputation, of its invincibility. But the illusion was cracking, and once a crack appears, it spreads like fire. The headlines turned. Shareholders who once worshipped him now cursed his name. Employees, thousands of them, watched their life savings evaporate, while executives whispered reassurances that meant nothing. The building that had once symbolized triumph now reeked of fear. Hallways filled with hushed conversations. Offices emptied overnight. Friends stopped returning his calls. Allies melted away. Kenneth felt it in waves. Anger, disbelief, denial. He clung to the notion that he had done nothing wrong, that he was merely a victim of circumstance, of forces beyond his control. The company will rebound, he told himself, even as bankruptcy loomed like a storm cloud too heavy to ignore. But deep down, a voice he could not silence whispered the truth. The empire he built was always fragile, and the fall was inevitable. And then, one day, the empire was gone. Enron filed for bankruptcy in December 2001, the largest in American history at that time. The mighty had fallen, and Kenneth was no longer a titan but a pariah. Cameras still followed him, but now they captured his downfall, his shame, his name forever stained. He was summoned to hearings, grilled by politicians who had once courted his favor, condemned by the very system that had once crowned him. The isolation was suffocating. Mansions felt like mausoleums. The silence of friends who once begged for his attention became unbearable. He watched as colleagues turned on each other, as once loyal allies testified against him, as his carefully crafted image dissolved under the harsh light of truth. But what hurt him most was not the wealth lost, nor the empire destroyed. It was the betrayal of trust. Thousands of employees had believed in him. Families had invested their futures in his vision. And in their eyes, Kenneth had stolen not just money, but dignity, hope, and years of labor. Alone, he would sit in dimly lit rooms, replaying his life like a broken film reel. The young boy in Missouri who dreamed of greatness. The man who built a corporate empire. The leader who promised loyalty and values. And finally, the figurehead of the greatest scandal of his era. Was it all ambition? Pride? Or had he convinced himself that the lies were truth? At night, the faces of his employees haunted him. People who had trusted, who had believed, who now stood ruined. He wondered if their voices echoed in boardrooms where he once ruled, or if they cursed him at kitchen tables as bills piled high. And sometimes, in rare moments of honesty, he admitted to himself that no amount of denial could erase the destruction his choices had unleashed. Kenneth was no longer celebrated. He was condemned. And though he still clung to fragments of faith, still tried to believe in forgiveness, the world was merciless. The higher you climb, the harder the fall, and his fall was a spectacle, a warning, a tragedy etched into history. Yet even as the weight of disgrace crushed him, Kenneth could not escape the flicker of memory, the intoxicating rush of applause, the nights when he was powerful, untouchable, adored. That flicker was both his comfort and his curse, for it reminded him of what he had been and what he could never be again. The boy from Missouri had wanted significance. He found it, but not in the way he dreamed. His name would not be remembered for triumph, but for ruin. For greed dressed as vision, for ambition unchained, for the empire that promised everything and delivered ashes. And so he lay in silence, staring at the ceiling of an apartment that once would have seemed beneath him, asking himself the question that would never leave him. Was it worth it? The night pressed heavily against the windows, and Kenneth thoughts drifted to the past, to moments when the world still believed in him. He could almost hear the roar of the trading floor, the applause of shareholders when he spoke at annual meetings. There had been electricity in the air, a collective belief that Enron was not just a company, but the future itself. He remembered the cameras flashing, the way his words seemed to shape reality, the way his employees' eyes lit with admiration. Power had been more than numbers on a balance sheet. It was oxygen. And now he was suffocating without it. The investigations dragged on, relentless. Prosecutors painted him as a man who had orchestrated fraud with cold precision, who knowingly lied while millions of dollars vanished. Kenneth told anyone who would listen that he was innocent, that he had never intended harm, that he had trusted the wrong people. But his words, once gospel, now rang hollow. Reporters captured every stumble, every nervous smile. Headlines no longer praised his genius. They crucified him with ink and truth. His wealth, once unimaginable, evaporated in lawsuits, fees, and liquidations. Luxury homes were auctioned, assets seized. Each sale felt like a chapter of his life being erased. The mansion in Aspen, the Houston penthouse, the art, the cars all gone, piece by piece, until the man who once stood atop the world found himself reduced to the essentials of survival. His empire had turned to dust, and with it, so had the illusion that he was untouchable. And yet there was something more devastating than the loss of wealth: the silence. Kenneth Lay had always been surrounded by advisors, assistants, allies. His phone had once rung endlessly with invitations, deals, and opportunities. Now it lay quiet. People who had once begged for his time now avoided his gaze in public. Former colleagues whispered in corridors of power, distancing themselves, rewriting history so that his name was no longer associated with theirs. Friends vanished, politicians cut ties, business partners melted into shadows. He had become a ghost while still alive. In courtrooms, he tried to hold his head high. He spoke of faith, of resilience, of his lifelong values. But juries are not swayed by words alone. They look at evidence, at lives destroyed, at pensions stolen, and futures ruined. Each testimony against him cut deeper, reminding him that the empire he built had not just collapsed, it had buried thousands in the rubble. And while Kenneth clung to his innocence, the faces of those who had lost everything were undeniable. Teachers, factory workers, engineers, ordinary people whose savings had been tied to Enron stock, whose retirement dreams evaporated in smoke. For them, Kenneth Lay was not a tragic figure. He was the architect of betrayal. Nights became harder. The silence of his home grew heavier. He replayed conversations with Jeff Skilling, Andy Fasto, and the other executives who had once been his trusted circle. Where had truth ended and lies begun? Had he truly been blind, or had he chosen blindness because it was convenient? Somewhere deep down, he knew the answer. Ambition had clouded judgment. Pride had silenced doubt. And the desire to remain a symbol of success had drowned out the warnings. Sometimes, in rare moments of clarity, he admitted to himself that his greatest crime was not the deception itself, but the refusal to stop. He had felt the weight of cracks in the foundation, yet demanded the facade stand tall. He had spoken of values while ignoring the screens of numbers that told a darker truth. Kenneth Lay had been a man who preached morality, yet built his fortune on illusions. And illusions, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually shatter. As his trial dragged on, his health began to fail. Stress carved lines into his face, his body weakened under the strain of public disgrace. The man who had once radiated confidence now seemed smaller, diminished, aged beyond his years. Even so, he clung to his faith, quoting scripture, insisting that God would deliver him from injustice. To some, his words were the ramblings of denial. To others, they were the desperate prayers of a man drowning in guilt. Then came the verdict: guilty. Convicted of fraud and conspiracy, Kenneth Lay was no longer just a disgraced executive. He was a criminal in the eyes of the law. The moment the words were spoken, he felt the ground fall away beneath him. There was no applause, no redemption, no mercy. His name was etched forever into the annals of scandal, alongside the ruins of Enron. But fate had its own plans. Before sentencing, before prison could claim him, Kenneth Lay collapsed. A heart attack stole the final chapter from him, leaving the world to argue over his legacy. To some, he was a victim of stress, destroyed by forces larger than himself. To others, his death was an escape, a cruel denial of justice for the thousands left broken in Enron's wake. Whatever the truth, his story ended not with redemption, but with silence, a silence that echoed louder than any verdict. And so, Kenneth Lay's name lived on, not as the boy who rose from poverty to greatness, but as the man whose ambition devoured him. His empire had promised the future, but delivered ruin. His wealth had dazzled the world, then vanished overnight. And his death, sudden and unresolved, left behind a legacy of questions with no answers. But perhaps the cruelest twist was this. Kenneth Lay had achieved what he always desired: significance. He had wanted to be remembered, to be larger than life, to escape the obscurity of his beginnings. And in that, he succeeded. But the memory the world holds is not of triumph. It is of betrayal, greed, and the cautionary tale of a man who flew too close to the sun, only to be consumed by the fire of his own making. In the end, his story is not one of wealth, but of warning. A reminder that ambition without restraint is a poison, that power without conscience is a cage, and that the fall from grace is always closer than it seems. Kenneth Lay's rise was meteoric, his fall catastrophic, his legacy unforgettable. He had dreamed of immortality through success, but instead, he achieved it through scandal. And as his name continues to haunt the pages of history, the question he once whispered to himself lingers still, carried on the lips of those who remember. Was it worth it?